let's bring in our very special guest again, Dr. Carolyn Freud, Dean of San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. Carolyn, let's start off by talking about what you do as a dean. And I want you to, if you could, let's go into your background a little bit, because you spent time at the World Bank. You are an expert in this industry when it comes to foreign policy. You've spent time on the China side of things, the Mexico side of things. So if we can just have a brief introduction, then I want to delve right into our questions with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I spent the bulk of my career in Washington, D.C., first at the Federal Reserve Board, where my last job was actually on the China desk. And that was back in the day where the Japan desk was actually more important than the China desk. I was just beginning to take over when I left and moved to the World Bank. And then I was at the World Bank for about 15 years. In my most recent job as director for global trade and investment.
What's it like in Washington, D.C. Right now with all these issues going on with the tariffs?
I think it's broader than Washington. I think everybody's very concerned, actually, even more outside of Washington, I would say in this case, because not that much manufacturing is done in Washington. So it's really folks that are interested, whether they're interested in producing here or importing, they don't know what things are going to cost next week, next month, next year. And so it's really hard to invest and to plan what you're going to do going forward. So I just see a lot of people waiting to kind of get some sense of predictability.
Let's get into our first question. So, in your opinion, what is the primary reason that President Trump has initiated these tariffs and caused what I like to call this global chaos, right? It was a campaign promise. He did do it in Trump 101, 1.0, excuse me. But now we're into a whole different realm that none of us, have ever seen in our careers. What is, in your professional opinion, what is his reason behind this? Because we have a hard time as money managers to sit here and say, it's for the good of the country, right? When so much financial destruction is going on, when so many relationships with our allies, such as Mexico, such as Canada, really have been broken down to rubble in some situations. What, in your opinion, it being, the experience that you have, what is his reason behind this?
Yeah, there are a few different reasons he gives depending on the day, but the one that has endured the longest and goes back to his views from the 1980s when Japan was the big economic threat is really about trade deficits. So Donald Trump does not like trade deficits. It means we're importing more from that country than we're exporting to that country. He has some very misguided views about what causes trade deficits. But even just using the formula that he developed with colleagues for setting the tariffs, it's clear that that is dominant in his mind. There's also, of course, discussion about raising revenues, bringing manufacturing back, slowing China's growth. So I think all of these play a role, but trade deficits really seem to be kind of at the center of what he's working towards.
I'm so thrilled that you have said that, because Jason and I have said that from day one when this whole chaos situation began. Explain to the audience why a trade deficit is a bad situation.
Well, so actually, a trade deficit isn't necessarily a bad situation. So, and there's two types of trade deficits. There's the aggregate trade deficit, which is how much you're importing. So you have an aggregate balance with the whole rest of the world and how much you're importing from them versus exporting to them. And if you run deficits for a long period of time on the aggregate like that, that could be a problem because eventually you have to pay it back. It means you're also borrowing money from the rest of the world. And just like any debt, over time, that could become unsustainable, especially if you're consuming it as opposed to investing it. If you're building factories and investing in your people, then probably in future you can pay it back. So it really depends how you're using the money, how big it is, how long it lasts. There's also bilateral deficits. So you could have a deficit with China, a deficit with Mexico, a deficit with Canada, a deficit with Europe. Economists tend to worry less about those because there's some countries where they may have things we need a lot of, like what before we produced a lot of oil here, we might need to import a lot of oil from oil producing countries. But it doesn't mean we need to export an equal amount to those specific countries. Just as, you know, economists like to joke that I go to Starbucks and I have a deficit with Starbucks, but UC San Diego has a deficit with me because they pay me. So it all just needs to balance at the end of the day. So I think we worry a lot less about bilaterals and a lot more, and we could worry about the aggregate. And the final thing I'll say is tariffs don't work to address the deficit. So
That was going to be the question I was just going to ask you.
It really seems like they should. You have a trade deficit, so put in a tariff. The thing about the tariff is it reduces imports, yeah, but then consumers switch to buying domestic goods, which reduces exports. So in general, the trade deficit stays pretty much the same because relative prices adjust. So it's kind of hard to understand, but the basic idea is if I'm consuming more than I'm producing, there's going to be a deficit. So unless Americans start consuming less or saving more, we're going to have that deficit.
Which is not the nature of our society, either one of those scenarios.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
so if you were an economist, what's that, Jason? Go ahead.
So we don't do either of those, unfortunately. Right. We consume and we don't save, and that's right. And that's the toughest part. What do you think are going to be the more longer term implications of these tariffs as far as U.S. competitiveness? Are you going to see more countries pull back from even wanting to initiate doing further business because of some of this concern?
Yeah, I think there are a couple different things. I think the first thing is most of the tariffs aren't actually in effect right now because there's this pause. So besides China, if we remove ourselves from China for a second, we're on pause. So the biggest effect is that we've shown ourselves to be unreliable. We promised to put tariffs at some level and now we're not. So we've created this kind of uncertainty, which again, investors don't like uncertainty, as you well know. So that's gonna hold back investors. So there's that effect. If the tariffs actually get implemented, it will make us less competitive because it's harder to import those parts and components you need. And these days, everything's produced in global supply chains. Be super difficult to do everything here. So it can hold us back in that respect as well. Now, over the longer run, maybe we're a big market, we're a rich country, maybe some folks want to invest here to build for our consumer. Yeah, that could happen, but we're unlikely to be globally competitive sitting behind this kind of tariff wall. I've had many investors tell me stories of how, they bring in parts and components and now it's more expensive to produce in the US than say Korea. So they're switching production actually out of the US. So they hurt and they help in this world. And I think we have to be careful. But I'm just most worried about the uncertainty because it's wreaking havoc on financial markets. And could, let's hope it doesn't, but it could lead to a really big global financial crisis with just this kind of chaos.
Let's pick up on that global financial crisis when we come back from break, Caroline, because that is something of concern to everybody. You're getting the word recession thrown around quite frequently now, where just a few weeks ago, it was a term that no one really wanted to use. Now it's being thrown around. And so I'd love to get your opinion on that. Our very special guest this afternoon is Dr. Caroline Freund, Dean of San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. Back to the John Sanchez Show on Newstalk 780 KOH with Jason Gaunt of Sanchez Wealth Management. And our very special guest this afternoon, Dr. Caroline Freund. She is the Dean of San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategies. And strategies you must be doing every day. Okay, Caroline, let's get to the question we kind of finished with it when we were going to break, and that is, Let's talk about your financial predictions of what can happen. As we said, the world is throwing around the term recession quite frequently now. At almost many Wall Street, many economists and strategists are saying, hey, you know what? We're in a recession right now. The data just doesn't show it. In your opinion, in your years of working at the Fed and the World Bank, et cetera, where could this end up going? What's the worst case scenario to tell the audience?
Yeah, I think recession is part of it, but the other part of it is that this could really be globally chaotic. And let's start with just US, what's happening here. Right now, a lot of folks are front loading their purchases because they're worried about tariffs. I've had neighbors talk about rushing out to buy a car because they're afraid of tariffs on autos. And I hear that that's happening quite a lot. And similarly, companies are rushing to bring in goods before tariffs hit. So there's lots flowing in. So when you look at this stuff just started being talked about this first quarter. So when you looked at the first quarter data, the economy looks pretty much okay, unemployment okay. But you're starting to hear about layoffs. Of course, there were government layoffs. Universities are freezing hiring, but it's starting to spread to other sectors. And you also see a fall in consumer confidence. So there is a danger that at some point we just kind of hit a slowdown in the US. Now, the global side of it, the big concern is 60% of reserve assets, the assets that countries hold, are held in treasuries and dollar denominated assets. Most trade, even when the US isn't involved, is invoiced in dollars just because the dollar is such a global currency. But people are getting afraid to hold dollars and dropping dollar assets. Now, if that starts to accelerate, and the dollar depreciates and bond yields spike, that is really going to be chaotic for business investment, for mortgages, for everything we do. So there's just way too much uncertainty. And it's a little bit like playing with fire in hopes of getting better deals from our partners. But it's a dangerous strategy.
Jason, real quick before you go to your question, I have to ask this. Carolyn, if you were sitting in the Trump administration as one of the economists or called upon in your current position as the dean, what would you be advising President Trump to solve this trade gap and trade deficit issue where he thinks that, again, the tariffs are going to do it? You and I and Jason agree that it's not. What would be your advice to him? Because that's where we're frustrated is why does he keep he's being told this by Treasury Besant and many others that, look, this isn't going to really solve the whole issue, but he's not doing anything about it. So what would be your advice to him?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple different things. The first is just predictability. We really need policy predictability and stability in order to keep investors investing, keep companies growing, keep developing jobs. So the first thing is please, please, please think through policies, have a plan before announcing it, et cetera. And then in terms of the trade side, really the only way to address that is to either increase savings, and there would be way to incentivize people to save more, or to reduce really consumption. Cutting the federal deficit is part of that because some of government consumption, of course, is spent on imports and is part of overall consumption. So he could focus more on the federal deficit, focus on incentives for people to increase savings. But this policy of tariffing, especially friends and allies, just makes no sense.
I agree. Jason?
And that's the part that I often struggle with is it feels, again, I'm sure there's more going on here, but obvious things. Clearly, we need to increase income on the deficit side. We need to tax more. Nobody wants to raise taxes. We've been talking about cutting taxes. So clearly the aim is to try to grow the corporate tax base, bringing jobs, bringing companies back here. We all know this isn't going to happen next week, next month, next year. But so there's that. We need to increase that. So we also need to get the deficit on the expense side down. But there's a demographics issue. You've got Social Security, Medicare, all of the health expenditures, defense, obviously, that are very demographically heavily pulled at right now, right? That's not going to be there forever. But the tough part is, just as you've touched on, the tariffs do not solve for China giving us money, right? It is a tax on U.S. consumers and U.S. businesses. And finally, the die was cast with confiscating Ukrainian Russian assets due to Ukraine. And I think you're going to see more of a spillover, unfortunately, like we've seen with dollar weakness and rates starting to tick up, of concern of U.S. as a counterparty. We were historically the safe place. That paradigm clearly in your seat, I would imagine, is starting to shift. I go back to the question before. What are the longer term implications? Because this seems like it's going to end up being more than a flesh wound. That's sort of, again, with John's question, what do we advise the president to do? Because it seems like it's ready, fire, aim, and he's not going to change that.
Yeah, I think it is ready, fire, aim, and he's not going to change that, except, and I don't think he's going to listen to my advice, but I think there is some advice he will take, and that's the advice from the bond market. So it was really bond yield spiking that caused him to pull back on the reciprocal tariffs. And and now with the market crashing, the dollar declining, bond yields continuing to be elevated, I do think at some point there's market discipline. At some point, folks around him are saying, you got to stop this chaos because you're debasing the dollar, you're killing our retirement, you're hurting people, and mortgage rates are going up, and so I think the market is the only thing that may succeed in disciplining him. I think the big worry is where people saw that the market can discipline. His reaction was to say, oh, Powell's not doing his job, which caused more chaos, because having an independent central bank is critical. Once you have a central bank that's run by politics, you're almost guaranteed inflation, because politicians always want interest rates to be low. So there is market discipline. So far, he's ignoring. He listened to it on pausing the tariffs. We'll see where it goes going forward. But it's really unclear.
Okay. On the other side of this break, I would love your opinion on Trump's comments about Powell being a loser and pressing him to cut interest rates, and your opinion as to why do you think the Fed hasn't cut rates yet. I have opinion. I'd love to hear yours.
Sounds great. Dr. Carolyn Freund, Dean of the San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, our very, very special guest. We will return in just a moment with our interview. Welcome back to the John Sanchez Show on News Talk 780 KOH with Jason Gott and our very special guest this afternoon, Dr. Carolyn Freund. She is the Dean of UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. She's an expert in international trade and economic development. She spent many years at the World Bank with the Federal Reserve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just an incredible wealth of knowledge. And what timing it is to have her on the program this afternoon. As Jason mentioned before we went to break, the situation that erupted today, it started on Thursday. The market didn't pay much of attention to it, but today it did. And that is when President Trump came out early this morning via Truth Social and called Jerome Powell, quote, a major loser, and warned that the U.S. economy could slow down unless interest rates are lowered immediately. He said the following, quote, preemptive cuts in interest rates are being called for by many. He claimed that there is currently virtually no inflation in the U.S. and that the cost for energy and most other things are on the decline. And finally, he said, with these costs trending so nicely downward, just what I predicted they would do, there can be almost no inflation, but there can be a slowing, in all capital letters, of the economy unless Mr. Too Late, a major loser, lowers interest rates now. Those were the president's comments on his True Social. So, Carolyn, let's follow up on your question, Jason. Let's go ahead and pose that one more time for those that just may have joined us.
I would just say that the question that I have is how long before this becomes more of a systemic problem, like you mentioned, dollar weakening, rates going higher, the comments about being a loser. But my question was, let me rephrase it. Sans these tariffs, wouldn't the Fed be starting to cut now? Yet Jerome Powell's been stuck into a corner. You've got tariffs, you've got inflationary pressures. They were late to raise rates, admittedly, last time. They don't want to be wrong this time, so they're waiting to see the whites of inflation's eyes come down. I think they would have been cutting had we not been tariffing, but now Trump announced all these tariffs, caused all this disruption, and is now taking shots at Powell. Just your thoughts as to what do you think the Fed would have been doing? And then are they in fact in a corner given the tariffs?
Yeah, I agree. I think they probably would have been. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and that, again, like the investors sitting on their hands, it's leading the Fed to be a bit more cautious. They were late raising rates. Tariffs, if implemented, will feed into inflation. And of course, they are already being implemented on China. The problem is, I just want to highlight that tariffs feed into typically one-time price increases. They don't feed into, the inflation rate. So every year leading to more and more or higher and higher prices. And the Fed, in some sense, isn't supposed to react to transitory changes. So that was why the Fed was late in raising rates, because they thought it was just due to COVID, a supply shock, but really there was kind of excess demand for goods. And I think just the uncertainty this time and the uncharted waters, and they already lowered, last year, even as recently as December, before we forget. So there isn't really a big cost to waiting another couple months to see what the data looks like.
Dr. Freund, when you're dealing with major Fortune 500 balance sheets, okay, let's pick one of the auto companies as an example. Let's say General Motors, and you're sitting in the C-suite and you're being told you need to bring manufacturing back here at home or expand on what you currently do. Forget about Mexico, forget about China, so on and so forth. How would you advise C-suite executives, and whether it's autos or any other manufacturing activity, on what to do? Because again, to your point earlier, we have a 90-day pause on the tariffs. Trump makes it sound very simple that they can just, turn on the lights and flip the switch on a factory that's been idle for many years, let's say in Detroit. We all know that's not reality. So what would you advise a C-suite executive to be doing right now? Take a deep breath, wait, maybe have to pay some of the tariffs for a while, or what would be the answer to that?
Well, I think, and they would know this looking through their own balance sheets, but to think about what they could do here given new technologies. So, and I think this is another important point, that even if we do bring manufacturing back here, it's not the manufacturing of the 1980s with lots of jobs. It's manufacturing with a lot of technology, a lot of robots, a lot of automation, and not very many jobs. And certainly not many not as many low skilled jobs as in the past. So I think that's important. But I think they could look through what they're producing and whether there are certain parts of production that it would make sense to do here and just accelerate those parts. So at the margin, maybe there's some stuff they can do, and then companies like to announce them. But mainly, there's not a lot of incentive to make huge changes, especially in something that wouldn't make economic sense, because maybe 5 years from now, we'll have a different president doing something different. And plants, as you know, take a long, long time to build. So I think at the margin, maybe there are a few things they could do, but the bigger picture is just a lot more complicated. And it's not clear to me we should be focusing on steel and aluminum and coal rather than being at the forefront on AI and biotech and new technologies, and really focusing on where we're already in the lead, technologies that'll be important for the future that right now we're throwing to China.
Yeah, at least for the moment. Yeah, no telling what's going to happen there. All right, we're going to take this final break. When we come back, Jason, the next question is up to you, my friend. Our very special guest this afternoon, Dr. Carolyn Freund. She is a dean of San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy and authors. We're going to discuss in a moment of Rich People, Poor Countries, the rise of emerging market tycoons and their mega firms. Our very special guest. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Freund. Welcome back to the John Sanchez Show on News Talk 780 KOH with Jason Gott and our very special guest this afternoon, Dr. Carolyn Freund. She is the Dean of UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. Once again, highly recommend you pick up her book, Rich People, Poor Countries, The Rise of Emerging Market Tycoons and Their Mega. It's such a great topic. Jason, let's wrap up. I think probably China, right? That's the $1 million question right now. So pose your question to her if you may.
Yeah, I mean, the emerging markets clearly near and dear to my heart. Lack of negotiations with China, obviously the stock market's pretty frazzled. Do you think this is about economic policy or political leverage? It's clearly China being the focus, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's still more about economics. So it's about the really large deficit with China. It's about the extraordinary subsidies to manufacturing in China. China accounts for about 30% of global manufacturing, and it's rising the share. So there is really a danger of being too dependent. So there's a political angle on it because whoever has power economically has power politically. But I think there is a danger that China has so much power economically that there are political dangers. And part of the goal of the tariffs is to slow China and, to either get them to play more by the rules, or, well, what I would like to see is to work more with our allies to create a group of like-minded countries that can create our own world rules, our own supply chains, and maintain security that way.
But isn't that what China's trying to do behind the scenes right now?
Well, yeah. So China and the U.S. are competing, and unfortunately, the U.S. is doing it with the stick of "we're going to hit you unless you play with us,"
right.
And China is doing it with the carrot of "come on, guys, we're actually the nice one.
Right.
We can give you money, we can do this, we can do that." So it's a little bit of a crazy world, and I would have preferred. But other countries are worried about too many goods coming in from China. So Europe's really worried about that now.
You've dealt with the Chinese for many years. How do you negotiate with them? Because it seems like right now, I've lost count. 45, 205, I mean, who knows what the exact tariff is. We're not buying anything. They're not selling anything. How do you negotiate with them? Because, Jason, you brought up a great point one day when we were talking on the show, and you said, look, they're looking 20, 30, 50 years down the road. We're looking the next quarterly report.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. I think they're not going to negotiate until the Trump administration is clear about what it is asking for. And nobody really knows. And they want to have technocrats get together and hammer out all the details. And then Trump and Xi get together and sign it and take a picture. Whereas Trump seems to want Xi to pick up the phone and give him a call, and they decide stuff. But you can't decide stuff without knowing what you want. And it's really, really unclear what exactly the Trump administration wants.
Where do we go from here?
We will see. I'm going to just give my optimistic scenario is the market disciplines Trump. He pulls back a little bit, starts playing nice with our friends, with Europe, with Korea, with Japan, with Australia, with the UK, etc. And we move towards, with Mexico, Canada, we move towards developing really secure and safe supply chains with those countries while managing a relationship with China because there's still a lot of, rare earths and other things we need from China, that medicine, ingredients that we won't be able to get away without. So, but we need to have a plan.
Yes.
It can't just be whatever I feel like today.
And that will calm Wall Street also.
Yeah.
Carolyn, it's been a great honor to have
Thank
you. We
you.
hope to have you on the program again. We wish you a great afternoon.
You too. Thank you. It was my pleasure.